First of all, 2 caveats and then 3 points. First, our modelling is a work in progress, and so the... Louder? Okay, sorry. Up. Our modelling is a work in progress, and so I reserve the right for the numbers in this to change slightly by the time we release it. The second caveat is that the modelling we are doing is actually, I say we've commissioned Jacobs, and so the numbers come from them. The 3 points that I want to start off making are, first of all, ultimately emissions need to get to zero or net zero, so I guess I'm splitting the difference between Frank and Steve. Secondly, because the globally agreed goal of limiting climate change to less than 1.5 to 2 degrees imposes a hard cap on the total amount of emissions that we can release, or, there's a hard carbon budget, the way that we get to zero matters a lot. And the third point is that the further we diverge from a pathway which puts us on the way to zero, the greater the risk of unstable policy. Because while there is a policy environment which doesn't set us on that trajectory, there's always the risk of more policies being added or current policies being strengthened. And so if you do not set your policies on a net zero pathway, you are institutionalising the kind of instability that we've already been suffering from. Now, the good thing is that net zero emissions is becoming more of a widely accepted concept overall, and I think within the electricity sector. So even before the Paris Agreement, the Prime Minister had articulated his recognition of this, the Foreign Minister, the Environment Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and around the middle of last year, the Australian Climate Roundtable, which brings together the peak industry associations, social and environmental groups, and us, put out a statement noting that Australia is going to be required to reach net zero emissions or below. The Paris Agreement actually puts a bit of a deadline on when net zero needs to happen. I'm sure you're all aware that the agreement requires countries to put forward continually strengthening emission reduction targets on a 5-yearly cycle. The other thing it does is reaffirm the goal of avoiding climate change of 2 degrees or more, but also pursue a limit of 1.5 degrees. And what that does is bring forward the deadline for net zero emissions. And so you can see from this table, the red square is where energy CO2 needs to be to have a 3 in 4 chance of that 2 degree goal and an even chance of achieving 1.5 degrees. So what we did was apply this to the electricity sector. What needs to happen in electricity to get us on that 2 degree pathway? And if we cannot get there by the most optimal policy mechanism, what are some of the second best options that we can use, separately or together, to reduce the gap between where we are now and where we need to be? So we've modelled 2 base cases. One is our optimal 2 degrees policy, based on the IPCC's 2 degree carbon price. This is a strong, predictable, global, technology-neutral carbon price. It's the thing that I think everyone would agree would be the ideal policy. It means that everything that happens in electricity under that price is what needs to happen to achieve the 2 degree goal. But in terms of its sort of real-world plausibility, there are a lot of obstacles in the way there. And with that in mind, we looked at what might be more possible in a real-world scenario. So we've got a second base case. We're calling it a weak carbon signal. And this is basically a carbon price between $20 and $40 by 2030. This maps on to where a lot of companies are already putting their shadow carbon prices. It is similar to, I think, where people think that the current policy mix might evolve. What we found is that it didn't have hope in hell of achieving the carbon budget set by the first optimal case, and so we had to add more policies onto that. So we looked at a 50% clean energy target, which is something else that has been put on the table. We looked at a 45-year limit on coal stations. We actually started off with a 50-year limit, but we found that it pretty much did nothing, or at least not enough to make much of an impact. And we looked at both of them. We also applied a low demand sensitivity to our best performing policy mix, which was that combination of the 50% clean energy target and the 45-year limit on existing coal stations. Under our weak carbon signal, what we did at 2030, in fact, under our weak carbon signal and all the policy scenarios that added on to that, when we got to 2030, we recalibrated the carbon price to try and achieve the carbon budget. So what this expresses in a way is Australia's trudging along on one of these pathways. At some point, in our case 2030, we realise we need to get our arse into gear to get to that 2-degree goal, and we jump to it. And so there is a carbon price shock of a sort, and things change very rapidly after that point. And two things about this, I think, are important and unusual in the types of electricity modelling that we tend to do. One is that our investors in our scenario don't have that perfect foresight that's generally assumed. The carbon price that they initially see is just one that glides up gently, up to about $40 in 2030, and they assume it will continue on. The other thing that this shows is that the costs of not acting don't just disappear when you don't act. They get pushed out into the future. And so with this scenario, we're also trying to show that the emissions that you don't abate now, they don't go away. You just have to abate them later when you have less time to do so. So this is what that looks like. The blue area is what you can call a sectoral carbon budget set by our base case 1, our optimal 2-degree policy. It's about 1,760 million tonnes. The dotted black line at the top is our weak carbon signal. It trots along to about 2030 and then falls off a cliff, having to go into negative territory for the last 15 years of the time period that we looked at, 2020 to 2050. So essentially the area under those curves is supposed to equal out, but you can see there are two very different pathways of getting to around zero emissions by 2050, and one perhaps much less manageable than the other. The blue line that sort of splits the difference between them is the policy scenario where we added the 50% clean energy target and the 45-year limit on coal. So you can see that starts the emission reduction process earlier, the trajectory is slightly steeper, it keeps us closer to the net zero emission pathway. It doesn't quite solve all the problems, but it keeps, I think the important thing here is that we're not aiming for perfect in the scenario, we're looking at what can close the gap. The other interesting thing, though, is that when you look at the same policy combination in a low grid demand world, which is the dotted bluish line down the bottom, actually it's not coming out very blue, it's that one. That shows that with very low demand, we actually easily achieve the carbon budget, and that has some interesting implications for ambitious energy efficiency policies, but then that has some interesting implications for how your market functions in a low grid demand environment, some of which have been touched on. The little orange dot, oh, sorry. Where is it? There. The little orange dot there is the government's target, 27% below 2005 levels by 2050. That's prorated for electricity. So if any of these scenarios is something like business as usual, it's that weak carbon signal one. Roughly, that would be on track to achieve the current 2030 target, which means that that cliff is the future. Two challenges that we were trying to solve here came out of the realisation that whatever it is that you're trying to do, you're going to have to close the existing coal generators at some point. I think we all accept that at some point all of these things will close. The question is more about when. So under each of these scenarios you can see different schedules and rates of retirements showing up in that reduced coal generation over time. Again, the weak carbon signal, done it again. If you delay it for a decade, you have to close just about everything very, very, very quickly, soon after that. If you started earlier, you've got a little bit more time. Similarly, We know that the amount of clean energy generated needs to rise significantly. If you delay that for a decade, it's going to have to be more sudden. If you started earlier, it's more manageable. And this is another graph that just shows capacity removals under the 3 scenarios. Again, this is just another illustration of that same point. Oh, sorry, I've lost control of the clicker. I've lost control of the screen. Ha. Basically, the big black spike down there is the closure of almost all the coal capacity around 2030. That happens in our weak carbon signal scenario. And I think it's worth thinking of that in terms of the effects that would have, whether you're thinking about impacts on communities where these coal stations are located, impacts on the electricity system where you need to replace a hell of a lot of generation extremely quickly and have a system that's capable of actually doing that. One of the other important, so if you think about the 45-year limit on coal, and I think just to Tony's point about regulation, I don't want to say that this is a perfect policy. It is definitely a second best policy. And if somebody's got another way of achieving the same sorts of outcomes through another mechanism, that's fine. This is kind of illustrative of some of the benefits of having a policy that allows you a foreseeable, preparable, reasonably regular, reasonably gradual phase out of high carbon capacity. One of the benefits that it has is that it reduces the job that you're loading onto other policies. So if you put in a 50% clean energy target and you don't have anything that swaps out the existing generation, you're essentially continuing the situation that we're in now, where you're requiring the forcing in of more clean capacity into an oversupplied market. And so the subsidy is going to make up for the low wholesale price. The subsidy is bigger. There's a greater degree of policy risk. You can see from the graph on the left-hand side that in terms of where the revenue comes from for those clean energy projects, the market provides around half, slightly less than half, slightly more than half if you have a mild carbon signal in there. And the certificate has to do a hell of a lot of heavy lifting. And it means that the overall costs of that policy are much higher. If you have something in there that phases out the high carbon generation, the graph on the right shows that by the end of that period, the market itself is actually driving most of the revenue for those investments. And so your policy risk is less and the size of your policy is less in terms of the subsidy that you're requiring. A couple of ways of thinking about the costs of this. So this is net present value, 3% discount rate, so that I can add in the US social carbon costs. But if you look at just the first 3 colours, so up to there. These are sort of the traditional resource costs, CapEx, OpEx, fuel, little stripe of retirement. The weak carbon signal, or our sort of business as usual scenario, means that we're going to be spending around $130 billion anyway in that decade. It doesn't cost that much more to do a better job. If you also factor in the societal costs of the emissions that you're not abating in that time, that you are going to have to deal with later, it's actually the most expensive option is to do the least. Just to explain these quickly, the dark grey area shows the United States Interagency Panel's estimate of the social costs of carbon emissions in terms of the climate impacts that they impose and what we should be prepared to pay now to address those costs. This adds on or shows what it would also be if you took their more risk-averse estimate of those costs. Another way of looking at it is to think about how much of an insurance premium are we prepared to pay to avoid that cliff that we'd otherwise create in emissions, or that we'd otherwise need in emissions in the future by paying a little bit more now. And about 40 billion for the combined policies scenario. But interestingly, a lot a lot less. You could save a lot of money if you put in really ambitious energy efficiency. However, one of the aspects about that, of course, is that that is going to keep downward pressure on the electricity market in terms of demand. So you've got a lot of levers to play with, but the interaction of those levers can get quite complicated. And that's why what I think we've realised is that, first of all, because the next 15 years are critical, that means the next 5 years are critical. We need to start figuring this out now so that we can have these policies in place so that they can reduce emissions in the 2020s. We also think that this shows that one policy on its own is not going to be capable of doing that unless it's that theoretically possible, theoretically optimal, but politically implausible, very high, very strong, very reliable carbon price. In the absence of that, we're going to need a policy package. We're going to need a number of tools. And that's going to have to include attention to the impacts of the transition, not just in the electricity sector itself, but on those communities that are going to be facing some of that in terms of the economic impacts on those regions. And the policy mix is going to need to include not just something that incentivises clean energy investment, but a mechanism that pulls out existing high carbon generation to allow the replacement of it with clean energy. And finally, the energy efficiency, I think, is really underappreciated lever. It can make this task a lot more affordable, but, and this just touching very briefly on the points that have already been expressed elsewhere, the way the market is set up now is not one that was designed to cope with flat or falling demand. So use of this particular lever use of any of these levers can no longer be done in isolation from the others. If we're going to use multiple tools, the interactions between them are going to be a risk. And so the best thing to do is really try and find the least bad combination of tools. Because ultimately, if we do not have enough emission reduction, we're just going to be stuck in the same place we are now, but with less time. I think that's it. There we go. That's the end.
Thank you, Olivia. Questions? We've got one here.
Hi, Jenny Goldie. Can you be a bit more specific about how old our coal-powered stations are? I mean, how old is Hazelwood, how old is Loy Yang, and so on? If we applied the 45-year rule, if we applied it tomorrow, what would happen?
I think we'd probably need to give a reasonable amount of time before it kicked in, which is part of the reason why we set up these policies as if they were to start in 2020. But some of the life of power stations ranges. So you have some that were built in the 60s, and you have some that were, I think, one in Queensland that was built in about 2001. So what this is going to involve would be ongoing exit of these power stations over the next couple of decades.
Thanks. Craig Memory from Energy Consumers Australia. Thanks, Olivia. Great presentation. Thanks, Tony, as well. I was just wondering, with the approach to phasing out coal-fired power stations that you took, what did you assume was replacing them in your modelling?
So we assumed that they would be replaced with clean capacity, which we define basically as under the 50% target. Clean capacity meant anything that had emissions intensity lower than 0.2 of a tonne of carbon per megawatt hour. So a range of technologies, both renewable and including CCS in our modelling.